there he gets back, proscribed, not allowed to go to France, lost all his friends at court, so he decided to write his memoirs. And the memoirs were they were published in Holland, and in 1702, if I remember rightly, and the following year they were published in England in an edition which I believe he had a hand in. And the Queen's Library for Usworth has a copy of that 1703, the original English version of Laontin, which I sort of hold in my hands and almost worship. But anyhow, then in the next 15 years, 20 years, there were more than a dozen editions of the Baron's work that appeared in French. And they had also appeared, as I say, 1 year later in English, and they were published in German and Dutch as well. And it's not possible to say at this point in time how many copies were published. But if you go back to the references in the literature of the succeeding years, if you go back and look at what was said at the time and the quotes and so on, you will find far more references to Laontin than to anybody else, especially the Jesuits. And in fact, just to leave it at the end of the story, he died relatively impoverished at the court of Frederick the Great of Prussia, and he was a great friend of Leibniz, who was one of the great minds at the time. And Leibniz, in one point, wrote to somebody who had asked, "Is this Baron? Can he be real? This strange person?" And he said, "Absolutely." In French, he said, "Le Baron de Laontin est un homme très réel, non inventé." In other words, he's a very real person, not invented. He knew him. And so on we go here, and let me just summarize some of this. The Jesuits started an onslaught against him because he absolutely hated the church. In fact, I'm not going to go into it here, but a big part of his memoirs is a dialogue avec un sauvage, and they cover such topics as sex, marriage, gender differences, warfare, courts of justice, and everything else. And the sauvage in the dialogue is he calls a Dario, but a Dario is based on Condillac, who you will find on your list of personages. And I'll tell you a little bit more about him because he was an extremely important man. Condillac was a Huron chief at Michilimackinac. We often think the Hurons were destroyed when the Iroquois attacked them. That's not true. There was a significant population in the upper Great Lakes, centered at Michilimackinac. There was a very large population of them north of Quebec City, and they still exist there. They used to be very renowned as canoe makers, and there are a large chunk of them called the Wendats or Wenandats or whatever, went to the United States, and there's something like 200,000 or more of them now in Oklahoma and other states, and that's a story in itself. But Condillac, who was a famous war hero, and even the Jesuits respected him. They said that Condillac is the only person in the colony who is equal to Frontenac, and Count Frontenac, the governor, and can hold his own in a conversation with Frontenac with his wit. So this man in here is the person to whom Laontin talks about religion, politics, sex, marriage, warfare, everything else. And not surprisingly, Laontin loses all the time. And the sauvage comes out and triumphant. And so a lot of people have looked at the influence of Laontin, but as I won't go on to it here, but Michelet, the famous French historian, once said that, I'm translating here, the thick and heavy shroud of which the books of the missionaries have hidden the world were uncovered. their ridiculous thesis that a non-Christian man isn't a man, one blow was reduced to nothing. No more privileges for God. No more for the elect, but all brothers. The identity of the human race. And that's Michelet in describing the influence of La Hontan. But as a thinker, he was not deep, but he wrote very profoundly, and he fascinated people, and he lies behind a great deal of the thinking of the siècle de lumière and so on. But I find him a very, even up until 30 years ago in French Canada, he was a bad guy. Bad guy to Abbé Gru, bad guy to others. I translate from a very good French-Canadian historian who was describing the books of La Hontan. And he says, with regards to morality and decency, the books of La Hontan are those which are best read perhaps sometimes at night in hiding, but on the first page of which one should inscribe this epigraph, which a contemporary author had placed in under the title of one of his novels. A mother should not allow her daughter to read it. And that was 30 years ago. But let me just, I got to leave him. I love the man too much, and I could just go on for the rest of the day, and that's not right. But he got a bad rap because if you read his books, you realize that he never puts himself in a good light. He's always in a bad light. He loses all the discussions with Adario, which is the nickname for Condé there. He, whenever there's a fight, potential fight with the English or the Iroquois, he goes and hides somewhere. And he got accused of turpitude because of this. And if you take him seriously, that's right. But I think he deliberately manufactured himself as a non-hero. Anyhow, he wrote his books. Within a year, they were plagiarized by a defrocked monk called Videville, whom you'll also see on here. And he lived in poverty for most of his life, and his existence, insofar as it's important to history, began when he came to Canada and pretty well ended when his books were published. He was not a public figure after. They disappeared. And I found something written by Milan Kundera, which just struck a chord in my thinking about La Hontan. That La Hontan's career as an author began and ended with his writing about North America. After that, he had nothing more to say. Milan Kundera mused on Odysseus' return to Ithaca after his years in the Trojan War and his difficult and prolonged return trip. This is a quote from L'Ignorance from Kundera. For 20 years, he had thought of nothing but his return. But once he'd returned, he understood, astonished that his life, even his life's essence, the center of his being, his treasure, laid outside Ithaca in the 20 years of his wandering. And this treasure he had lost and could only recover in the telling. And I think that's what happened with La Hontan.